I'm Amitav Chaudhary, co-convener of the Global History Initiative here at Queen's University. And I would like to begin by thanking all of you for coming here and for welcome you to Kingston and to Queen's University, and especially to the inaugural conference of the Global History Initiative. This is not a bad time to visit Kingston, I think. The students are busy writing their exams. And last night I saw one of those vehicles that suck away dirt and sand and grit from the sidewalks, which tells me that the snow season is over. And that gives me a great pleasure. You have come from all over North America, and many of you have had interesting life experiences in different parts of the world. And I'm especially heartened to see those who have crossed borders for the sake of global history. It's not a mean feat these days. I'm also very pleased to see some of my own colleagues, associates of the GHI here, who have joined us as active participants and presenters in this conference. And I'll get to know all of you in the next couple of days or so. I'm especially pleased to see and welcome back my former student, Joey McQuaid, who is just days away from defending his PhD at Cambridge University and taking up a postdoc at Toronto. And glad that you could make it. Our local domestic flight almost sabotaged our plan, but you overcame. So I'm indeed very glad to see all of you. Some thank yous are in order. Nugent Fund, the Bernice Nugent Bequest, which has carried the financial burden of this conference. And it's really a blessing to have this endowment. It allows us to host events like this and invite speakers from abroad. Thanks to our department, the intellectual home of this initiative, to our current chair, Rebecca Manley, our former chair, Jamie Carson, who have, without exception, supported all our endeavors and our plans. Thanks to our departmental staff for not only being extremely helpful throughout with the logistics, but also for being vigilant, pointing out when the posters should be up on the wall. And I want to thank Diane Whitelaw, our graduate student assistant for this conference. She has done a remarkable job behind the scenes, putting together the nitty-gritties quietly and quite efficiently. Perhaps no formal thanks is necessary, but I would be remiss if I didn't mention my co-conspirator and colleague, Ishita Pandey, who, as some of you might not know this, has single-handedly undertaken the academic planning of this conference. And I thank you all for coming here today. Now, with this, even this evening, the Global History Initiative at Queen's comes into being. It's something that we have been thinking about and planning for a while, but we wanted to have this alongside a conference with a keynote event, and I'm glad that it worked out that way. In the next couple of days, we'll find out more about the initiative. There's some information up on the website. The website was operational, has been for a few months, but it was made public only yesterday. So the GHI is really a research forum, and it is a research forum with the intent of nurturing and interrogating the concept of global history, not as a globally inclusive perspective, not as some sort of an Archimedean vantage, but more particularly as a critic, as an historiographical critic, as a critic of methodological nationalism, which as a project is or becomes urgent precisely when global forces are eclipsed, when globalization is held as captive. The initiative functions on three levels, or three layers, I would think. Locally, we try to foster and further the idea of global history through our teaching, through conferences, workshops, our publications. Regionally, we serve as a network of institutes and institutions in North America with similar initiatives, similar programs or research clusters in global history. And in this, we already have a formal understanding of mutual recognition with Harvard University's Weatherhead Initiative. So in some sense, today's event also serves as an inauguration of our regional network as well. And third, globally, we are in the process of setting up a global network of similar initiatives, and we are in the process of discussing such arrangements and partnerships with institutions in India, Germany, Norway, Austria, and South Africa. The goal is not only to develop global history worldwide, which we'll do through mutual exchanges, faculty exchanges, workshops, conferences, publication projects, but more importantly, perhaps to provide a platform to our graduate students in this network as a platform for student exchange, for semester abroad. One of our students spent a semester at Harvard last year. Also co-supervision, perhaps, dissertation committees, student workshops, and postdoctoral positions. So all those are goals and plans and hopes for the future. We will keep you informed in the next few months and years, and we just have begun. So with that, I would like to welcome you once more and have a great conference, and I'll ask Ishita to take over now.
It is a real pleasure to welcome Jeremy Adelman to Queens and to Kingston. It was a little touch and go today, so I'm also very relieved and not just pleased that he is indeed here. Jeremy Adelman is the Henry Charles Lee Professor of History and the Director of the Global History Lab at Princeton University. Jeremy himself has crossed many borders. He has lived and worked in 7 countries and 4 continents. After graduating from the University of Toronto, Jeremy did his master's at the London School of Economics, and then he got his PhD at Oxford University, where he was, I believe, in the same year as Sandra Den Otter.
And Elizabeth Elborn.
And Elizabeth Elborn. Oh,
we were all nerd mates together. It's so weird.
So, but it wasn't nepotism or anything of that sort that got him here. But he does have many friends. So his first book, Frontier Development, Land, Labor, and Capital on the Wheatlands of Argentina and Canada from 1994, compares the agrarian systems in the late 19th and early 20th centuries in Argentina and Canada. His Republic of Capital, Buenos Aires, and the Legal Transformation of the Atlantic World from 1999 won the American Historical Association's Atlantic History Prize, and it explores the emergence of the Argentine Republic and its incorporation into the world market in the 19th century. His third book, Sovereignty and Revolution in the Iberian Atlantic, published in 2006, tells the story of the downfall of the Spanish and Portuguese empires and the making of nation-states in South America, braiding together intellectual, economic, and political histories. His most recent book, Worldly Philosopher, The Odyssey of Albert O. Hirschman from 2013, is a chronicle of one of the 20th century's most original thinkers. Currently, Jeremy is working on 2 books. The first one, Latin America, A Global History, is forthcoming with Princeton University Press. Is it already out?
No.
Okay. And it tells the story of what we now call Latin America as an ongoing regional site for world making and integration from 1492 to our days. He's also working on Earth Hunger, a study of how writers and artists, diplomats and ecologists have been wrestling with the meaning of global interdependence and attitudes towards strangers from the 1850s to the present. Sweeping projects, all of them, and these make Jeremy the perfect guest for the launch of the Queen's Global History Initiative that Amitava just talked to us about. Earlier this winter, I should mention, Jeremy caused quite a debate amongst academic historians as well as public historians, and maybe even a Twitter storm with his provocative piece, What is Global History Now? In this widely circulated piece, he provoked us to consider narratives of global life that reckon with disintegration, just as they do with integration and connections and so on. Professor Adelman has pioneered teaching in world history as well, and he's the editor of 5 books. And the co-author of Worlds Together, Worlds Apart, which is a history of the world from the beginning of humankind to the present. So it has quite a sweep. And when I was a graduate student, I think we were reading the draft of this manuscript in our world history seminar. So that's how old is it? He has been the recipient of the Guggenheim Memorial Foundation Fellowship and the ACLS Frederick Burkhardt Fellowship, as well as recognitions for his teaching from Princeton. Jeremy was the history department chair. This is not the most important part, but it's important to me. When I applied for a job at Queen's, and he encouraged me, told me a lot about Canada and Queen's when I didn't know a lot about it. So it's particularly a particular delight to be able to welcome him to Queen's almost a decade later. His lecture today is entitled The Witness and the Other, Photography and the Origins of Humanitarianism. Please join me in welcoming Jeremy.
Thank you, Ishita. It was a while back since we worked on that textbook. So many reunions with my old Oxford classmates. I was here, I don't think it was to the day, but it was 25 years ago, certainly this spring, I think, when I interviewed here. So it's nice to be home, in a way. But it's nice to be back in Canada. This is home. So thanks to the organizers. Ishita, I've been looking forward to hearing so much more about the Global History Initiative and thinking about ways in which Princeton and students and colleagues at Queen's might collaborate and work together. So what I'm going to do today is talk about something that I've been working on for an anthology about the history of photography and image making and humanitarianism, but it's also part of a wider project that Ishita alluded to called Earth Hunger. That's a term that an economist, turn of the last century economist named John Hobson coined after returning from South Africa and thinking about why, in spite of the growing interdependence of the world, countries, the leading powers, were so bent on conquest and rivalry. So it's a story about global thinking since the 1850s, about the growing recognition of interdependence, and in a sense the pendular swinging between one world utopianism and vicious hatreds. But let me start from our global present before going back to a different global moment, and we can talk about the continuities and discontinuities between them, to think about the significance of strangers in our lives. This is the cover of the New York Times last fall in the midst of a presidential campaign in the United States. I'll come back to that at the end of the talk, and what we think about Aleppo in our day and age. But just a note to say that we live in an age of a war of images of war, and a war over images. This is a collage of the dust-up that got created by that one photograph of the little boy pulled out of the rubble in Aleppo. And of course, you're all very familiar with the image of Alan Kurdi, This went viral. I'm not going to sit on because stay there because it's such a disturbing image. But it, of course, also produced a reaction. In some cases, declarations of fatigue at people being bombarded with images of the suffering in Syria. But let's look back at, in a sense, the first of the wars over images and photographs as they brought the image of the stranger into people's homes. In the Gutenberg Galaxy, 1962, Marshall McLuhan famously noted how cables and wires had turned the human family into a global village. What made the shrinking of the world village-like for McLuhan was the intensified awareness of what was going on elsewhere. And not just awareness, but concern and compassion. The TV boxed the world into a flickering screen of voices and images, and after 1953, color broadcasts began to replace the not-so-old black and white sets. And by the mid-1960s, the rush was on to bring the globe to the screen in its full rainbow spectrum. In fact, while McLuhan was writing those words in the Gutenberg Galaxy, the old village was already an endangered species the moment that railways, surveyors, and tax collectors moved in. The New World swapped strangers for neighbors and held them together by anonymous threads of mutual dependence between people they would never know. One of the ironies of Marshall McLuhan's global village metaphor is that he coined it just as American B-52s were about to shower napalm over Vietnamese villages. A decade after the Gutenberg Galaxy, newspaper readers around the world were greeted by a photo taken by the journalist Nick Utt of a scorched, naked 9-year-old girl, Kim Buck, aka Napalm Girl, fleeing her burning village. We can talk more about the photograph and the arguments that took place in the editorial room in the New York Times over the decision of whether or not to put the image on the front page. Actually, and as an aside, I should say that decision to put the little boy pulled out of the rubble in Aleppo produced yet another debate inside the editorial room in the New York Times about the representation of children on the front page of the paper. One of the horrified readers that morning when it appeared in the Times was Susan Sontag. And she would write a year later, after the photograph was published, in a seminal essay called On Photography, that the sight of Kim's agonized face was, and I'm going to do this unfortunate thing just to separate my voice from the voice of the protagonist, but was more memorable than 100 hours of televised barbarities. It may even, she speculated, have done more than anything else to mobilize the anti-war movement. The shock of Kim's face changed history, she insisted. But most images of horror did not. They saturated the public sphere, overdosed the viewer, made the suffering seem like a natural condition. The ubiquity of suffering, Sontag worried, summoned as much apathy as empathy. The jet age and the triumph of typographic man, Marshall McLuhan, had created an illusion of togetherness. And 3 decades later, her concern that images help us see, but not necessarily to feel, turned into fury. In her last book, Regarding the Pain of Others, a meditation on photography of suffering in the wake of the butchery in the Balkans in the 1990s, Sontag railed against media studies gurus devoted to separating the spectacular from the subject. And she also went after, it's worth adding, the soft-minded who wander in a perpetual state of shock at worldly depravity. Between attachment and detachment, togetherness and distance, how did people create ethical attachments to strangers? What did the illusion mean? Sontag observed that photographs haunt us while narratives make us understand. In other words, and this is what's important for the story that we'll explore this afternoon, what frames the significance and the meaning of photographic images are the stories of which they are a part. So what are these stories, or what were these stories? And what I want to do in the paper this afternoon is to go back to the start and look at some of the connections between photographs and narratives in the early decades of modern commercial integration in the 19th century. As images circulated, photographic images circulated, as rulers and ruled contended with sovereignty, unfree labor, and the civilizing mission in the age of high empire. And as I mentioned earlier, it's part of a larger work about how people from different parts of the world reckoned with global integration from the time that it became visible and a subject for social theory in the middle of the 19th century. And I'm going to maybe get some pushback from 18th century intellectual historians. Didn't Adam Smith have his finger on something? We can come to that if you want. But here it's to push beyond the language of cosmopolitanism. And Nishita alluded to this piece in Aeon magazine about the concerns with the cosmopolitan way in which we were framing global histories. You can hear kind of echoes of this. To push beyond cosmopolitanism, in Anthony Appiah's terms, to imagine strangers. Rather, I'm interested, and I want to kind of push this with you, in how people learn to think about interdependence, not just curiosity in other people, but the recognition of their dependence upon other people. The part I want to explore here unfolds in the late 19th century with the convergence of three forces, just to go through them very briefly. One of them is clearly technological, as new technologies of communication and transportation laced the world together. Shipping, especially steam, bracketed by the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869, the Panama Canal in 1914. In addition, and I guess you can't see these maps too well, but long-distance telegraphic cabling and the railway lowered transportation and communication costs. The second force, if transportation and communication is one, the second was the rise of a global public sphere. And I can't go into any detail here. We can talk about more in the Q&A if we have time. But the opening of news agencies around the world and networks of reporters were part of a growing business in international reportage, which in fact piggybacked initially on the importance of commercial news, of prices, and so forth. This had started with Reuters and got a boost when newsprint shifted from cotton to pulp-based paper, which lowered costs and made it easier to print on larger sheet runs. You'll see that magazines and newspapers play an important part as the host for these photographic images. And then, of course, came the application of the linotype printing, the explosion of newspapers and magazines worldwide in the 1870s and 1880s. And to this, I would add, and again, if there are any gearheads in the room, the advent of the camera and the transition from plates and daguerreotype to more portable devices. The Kodak, which had adapted celluloid and after 1900 created the film canister for processing film. And finally, the Leica in the 1920s with spools of 35 millimeter canisters that you can swap out in an instant. And we're on to the heroic photojournalist shooting the decisive moment. Right? And in between, printers figured out a way to apply photographic images to cheap newsprint in 1897, just in time for the War of 1898. Speaking of 1898, here is the third variable, which is, of course, the spasm of imperial expansion and commercial integration of the last frontiers, if Frederick Jackson Turner was to be believed, into a world economy. And these three variables then provided the backdrop of global integration of distant villages, creating a world of exchange, circulation, and intervisibility. What I want to focus on now is how integration became news, how commercial binding pushed observers beyond curiosity, the cosmopolitan trope, and the stance of the distanced observer, but to become, in the Israeli philosopher Avishai Margalit's words, moral witnesses to economic integration. The moral witness is someone who records a public memory of pain, taking some risk to bear witness to the first-hand experience of suffering. The result is a moral connection between the victim and the viewer, or the reader. In this case, we'll talk about the viewer. And the point of the moral witness was to mobilize the senses, to intermediate in creating long-distance ethical bonds between strangers. The creature of the global media, the witness produced encounters with faraway places and people without requiring a physical uprooting. The reader, the viewer, the consumer could come face to face with strangers without having to move. That was the Susan Sontag experience in her apartment in New York. It was enough to transport the reader's imagination to consider how the other lives. And there would be, in fact, a proliferation of books starting in the 1890s about how the other half lives and dies. The moral witness blunted and heightened long-distance sensitivities. So, one of the keys then is to underscore how we might ask about what, in a sense, trips back and forth between these two emotive states, between apathy and empathy. What I'm going to focus on this afternoon then are the brokers in this process, the witnesses who created the images for the world to read and to view. Let's start with one example, a pioneer. His name is Felice Beato, the Venetian-born huckster, wound up in Constantinople during the Crimean War. Again, if you want to know more about Beato, I'm happy to go on and on about him. He's a fascinating character in the story. And it was in Crimea that he learned the art of photography from a British military portraitist. Again, I can go into more detail if you want on that one. And together they went out to battle scenes after the carnage, and this was beginning to become something that military photographers were experimenting with, and were the first to record the wreckage. In fact, would simulate the wreckage, often moving things around like props to create the image of a battle scene, because of course technologically they could not capture live action yet. But Beato took the craft of photographing the battle scene after the fact to new heights and in new directions. To India, a very famous photograph of Lucknow after the so-called mutiny. To Japan, he went to China in 1860 to shoot the Second Opium War, and was the first to carry a camera into Peking, into Peking, and his glass plates would then become the first pictographs of the Forbidden Palace, and would circulate around the world in albums, books, and transcribed onto the pages of magazines. Here were the images now of the real China, as the lens gave the illusion of objectivity. See for yourself, said the photographs. Look at the splendor. Observe the decay. The Middle Kingdom is ripe for the taking. In 1871, he would then go on to accompany an American expeditionary force on an attack on Korea, and was the first to record Americans in battle, photographically battles of Americans in battle abroad, engaged in the fight to open markets and defend Christian missionaries. I'll come back to Christian missionaries. Bring Elizabeth into the story here. For Beato was one of the many that recorded the world as it was becoming integrated. Though one might say that he was the first globe-trotting photojournalist, intimately entangled with warfare, empire, and contested meanings of sovereignty. In fact, he made his money at creating photographic albums for the officers, but also for wealthy travelers. Here's an image of Dom Pedro, the Emperor of Peru, in 1871, after the death of his daughter, Leopoldina. He went on a trip to Egypt, and this is a photograph that Beato took for him at the Giza necropolis. And of course, his plates would be used for the drawings of the London Illustrated News. As a result, from the middle of the 19th century, regard for strangers quickly spread and evolved. Sympathy for or curiosity about strangers were no longer the only motives for thinking about other people. Whether it was the Indian Mutiny and the fight of the East India Company to force its monopoly in Bengal, or American forces in Korea busting open trade for their merchants, these global concerns were different. They were about the arrival of capitalism's greatest wedge, the idea of self-interest. Consider the suddenness of the shift. For instance, what abolitionists against the slave trade did not do before 1860 was appeal to self-interest. After all, it was the tyranny of self-interest that had to be overturned in favor of a commonwealth of altruists. In other words, here we're beginning to recognize the ways in which personal self-interest enters the story as something that tethers people together. But just as abolitionists proclaimed the moral victory in the 1860s, a whole new way of thinking about interests in the fate of strangers was storming onto the global stage. And this intensified in them just compressing the story in the 1890s, partly because of a series of technological breakthroughs, partly because of the world economic downturn, partly because after the First Sino-Japanese War, increasing imperial entanglements and conflicts would elicit a recognition of, in a sense, togetherness, bound together in this rivalrous and intervisible world. The 1890s also saw the last of the internal frontier resistances against imperial integration, the global enclosure process, and the arrival of the colonial picturesque in the form of images for the Canadians among us, the Métis, and of course images in the United States of Wounded Knee. And in Brazil, as we're talking about the emperor, someone called Euclides da Cunha, who had been the flower of Brazil's dedication to European models of progress. Trained at the elite military polytechnical school in Rio de Janeiro, he was raised the humble mestizo grandchild of a Portuguese slaver and a Carari Indian. Brazil, country of sugar, coffee, and rubber, harvested from the land to be consumed elsewhere, was an archetype of global economic integration. And for those for whom progress washed aside, the integration into the wider world meant disintegration of local worlds, hence the piece in Aeon about the attention to the ways in which global integration produces simultaneously a process of disintegration. This too would be captured by the photographer. And these included Brazil's backlanders, known as sertanejos, from the impoverished Northeast, a mixed-race people, part Indian, part slave, ex-slave, vaguely European, scraping a life out of the Arab scrub or working as indentured laborers in faraway rubber forests in the Amazon. And you'll see when we get later on, the question of free and unfree labor will hover very large in the story as well. In 1893, 30,000 of them, the sertanejos, led by a messianic preacher man called Antonio Conselheiro, took refuge in the interior of Bahia in a forgotten hamlet called Canudos. Like the Plains Indians and the Métis peoples of North America, the Boxers in China, or the Doukhobors of Russia, we can talk about the Doukhoborski if you want, the sertanejos of Brazil defied state authorities and their plans. Global integration was not for them. As in China, Russia, Canada, and the United States, the Brazilian military marched to the backlands to crush the rebellion. It took 10 infantry and artillery battalions, mortars, howitzers, and a prolonged siege to reduce Canudos to a valley of starvation and dysentery. Then the army swept in, and about 15,000 sertanejos died in the butchery. This is a photograph of the refugees. As the collision of two worlds ended in atrocity, the civilizers brought witness to the historic events to chronicle the triumph of reason, science, and progress for its worried patrons in the distant cities. So as the military was waging this campaign, they also invited reporters and photographers to go and chronicle the story for complicated reasons, for readers from the south of Brazil. The most famous of all was da Cunha, the man of Science and Reason that I alluded to earlier, who had joined the troops as a reporter for a Sao Paulo newspaper. Now, if da Cunha, as a scientist, had dreamed of a redemptive purpose, the scene afforded none. It left him horrified about the massacre in the name of civilization, and he would pour his dismay into one of the great works of Brazilian literature, Os Sertões, published in 1902, as an ode to a world destroyed by progress. Likening the story to earlier peasant resistances to the modernization of the French Revolution, Canudos, da Cunha lamented, was our Vendée. This photograph was taken in 1897 by Flavio de Barros, hired by the military to photograph the actions. And this is now becoming standard operating procedure. In fact, balloons were being used to take photographs of military operations. The military were, in a sense, among the first to recognize the possibilities of the use of the camera. In this particular case, it was to propagandize for the suppression of the uprising to readers in the south, the developed part of Brazil. And Barros owned a photography studio in Salvador called Fotografia Americana. Present for a decisive attack on Arraial de Canudos, he created an album covering the military actions. And the images were included then, this photograph in particular, in the first edition of that book that I mentioned, Os Sertões. And it is hard to imagine the text without its illustration. And every school child in Brazil is familiar with them, almost more so with that photograph than with the book itself. Although nobody knows who the photographer was. They just know who authored the famous book. So a curious thing happened in this first global Gilded Age. Just as the almighty Mr. Moneybags, as Marx would put it, was at his zenith and unbridled to expand the workings of market forces, and empires tromped around the globe to fashion it in the eye of the civilizing beholder, another global actor took the stage, mostly unknown, like Chibarros. For accompanying the market integration was a system of communications and exchange. And what brought the news of prices and business opportunities from afar also brought the plight of strangers to the door of public opinion. It is impossible to disentangle the spread of private capitalism from the formation of a global public sphere. By giving press to doings and wrongdoings in distant parts, often at the behest of the very same empires and employers that were stitching it together, a breed of who would become self-described as humanitarian reporters produced a moral, literary, and visual stories about commercial integration and imperial governance. Confronted with evidence of so much injustice and wreckage, it's tempting to see global peripheries, like this one, as zones of relentless oppression or tropical madness. But not all witnesses were so invested in a division of labor that portrayed pain and passivity far away and responsibility and agency back home. Rulers were also interested in knowing, categorizing, visualizing, and fathoming the other at the edge of their crowding kingdoms. Morals and interests, then, could also join forces. Here's an example. The Slavophilic Nicholas II had a romantic attachment to the ever-suffering Russian peasant. But he was also curious about his other, more remote subjects, notably those in the fraught Caucasian borderlands. And note the importance of these borderlands in summoning a lot of this activity, where Sunni Ottoman and Shia Persian influences echoed among what he called the disloyal, what was often known as in Russia in the late 19th century, the disloyal minorities, which only intensified, as you can imagine, after the Anglo-Persian Treaty. His curiosity led to one of the greatest enterprises to photograph the other. The Russian photographer Sergei Mikhailovich Prokudin-Gorsky used a special color photography process, and there's some dispute whether Prokudin-Gorsky was the first to use color photography at the time. There are French who claim it was French. The Russians claim it was Russian. I'm staying out of that one. But he did use this special process using glass negatives to create a visual record of the Russian Empire and the Eurasian encounters it had forged. Photography, he noted, penetrates into all domains of knowledge. Memory, aided visually by an interestingly exhibited subject, will leave our ordinary methods of memorizing far behind. Unquote. Here are some of his images. He captured a new era, he captured an era, a people on the eve of revolution. Prokudengorsky did more, though, than simply snap, as we would now say, group portraits set against Caucasian backdrops. And in this particular case, of portraits of women in front of their adobe homes, a world of narrow horizons now made accessible to viewers with expanded ones. A chemist by training and the student of the inventor of the periodic table, Mendeleev, Prokudengorsky took what he knew about spectral analysis and photochemistry to make his images, finding a way, he believed, to close the gap between the observer and the observed with color. To that end, he angled the Grand Duke Mikhail Alexandrovich, the aristocratic honorary chairman of the St. Petersburg Photographic Society. Photography, ever since its beginning, was always something that blurred the distinction between the amateur, like me, and the professional. And there's actually a lot of literature on, particularly in a famous book by Roland Barthes about the photography is the triumph of the amateur portraitist. Alexandrovich, who'd seen some of these images, particularly the 1908 very famous portrait in color of Leo Tolstoy, which made him awestruck, impressed by this, that led to a special invitation to present for Prokudengorsky to present his work at the imperial court in the winter of 1909. The Grand Dukes and Duchesses took their seats in the great auditorium. The lights dimmed. The chatter turned to a hushed silence. The Emperor of all Russians, the Tsarina, and the Romanov children entered through the right door, and Prokudengorsky knew how to put on a slideshow. And we'll see. The question of slides is going to be important for us in a minute. You'll see. The lights went out. And from the blackness there burst forth projections of autumn landscapes to appeal to the Empress Alexandra, portraits of peasant children for aristocrats who ruled them without ever having seen them, and rustic basilicas, rustic basilicas to remind the audience of their subjects' faith. And when the show was over, the Tsar deputized Prokudengorsky to create a visual inventory of his realm. Unable to see the corners of the Russian Empire himself, he commissioned Prokudengorsky to create images that could do the job. He also, in the case of Prokudengorsky, applauded the idea, along with the Tsar, of using photographs for broader educational purpose to represent imperial society up to the limits of its dominion. With a carte blanche and the support of the transportation ministry and a special Pullman coach, we have photographs of how he traveled around, as an itinerant home and darkroom, so one of the coaches was an entire lab for processing the photographs, Prokudengorsky spent 5 years shooting the empire in its final days, creating a picturesque tableau of imperial subjects, the now visible minorities of the Tsar. The images, this is a stunning one from Samarkand. The images are worth attention not just for their majesty or for the pathos of the subject matter, but the idea of capturing other worlds in the deep Caucasus and Central Asia, relatively recent conquests, I might add, by the Tsar, exemplifies the age of creating encounters by using new technologies. In fact, the more remote the subject, the better, as far as Prokudengorsky believed. From the Muslim mountaineers of Dagestan, Tatars, Kurds, Gruzinians, Armenians, these were people who had never been seen, but for the occasional surveyor, tax collector, or the intrepid Oriental scholar. A century later, from our vantage point, Prokudin-Gorsky appears to have captured timelessness itself. Turbid people, in this case from Samarkand, the Silk Road, posed before their decaying temples. But we have to remember the whole point of the enterprise, and ones like it, was to portray the other as more than a curiosity. The Tsarist regime made tribesmen fellow subjects, serene in their stoic posture, or, as in this case, gathered in the semblance of a family portrait, the quiet co-members of an empire. There is no threat, no menace, no violence to this other. That was Prokudin-Gorsky's point, to represent back to the Tsar the underlying peace and loyalty of these far-flung others. Now, the proliferation of newspapers and magazines, school books, this was one of Prokudin-Gorsky, get the photographs of these new subjects into the schools of the Russian Empire, created an international reporting regime then for humanitarian brokers. Imperial entanglements fed the intermediary with a steady diet of images and stories. The material for the witness, the muckraker, the novelist, the photojournalist, was the other, who became a battleground for ideas about civilization and superiority, as well as rival visions of a world consumed by empire. Nowadays, we tend to think of the media activist as the crusader for the victim, the rapporteur insurgent, speaking truth to power, but sometimes the moral witness labored on behalf of power, promoting the civilizing mission, as is the case for Prokudin-Gorsky, or in the case of d'Acunha, who flipped sides then, insisting that the pain of integration was also the colonizers. No one expressed this more than Rudyard Kipling. For the moral case for empire was made most famously by Kipling in his epic statement, came in reaction to, it's worth remembering, the United States' war against Spain in 1898, and more importantly, in its aftermath. The war was hugely controversial. It's worth recalling. As Washington's resolve waned after the war ended, wavered, and the pro-empire camp appeared to lose its bearings once the Spanish Navy went down to defeat, the Bard of Rule Britannia stepped in. To bolster Yankee determination, Kipling penned an ode to imperialism with a humanitarian face, The White Man's Burden. Published originally in McClure's magazine and subtitled, this is often forgotten too, The United States and the Philippine Islands, the poem earned an immediate career as a paean to philanthropic domination of dark-colored and sullen people. Kipling's was an appeal to a white imperial manhood and a new internationalized race mandated to uplift the others. Kipling's slogan also had commercial value. Pear's soap adopted it before century's end to promote the virtues of bathing as the key to lightening the skin and sails in the dark corners of the earth. Of course, the poem's aspirational qualities soon contrasted with the images of savagery of the wars that spread across the Philippines. American troops saw their wards as, quote, niggers or scum, lazy, double-dealing, and shifty. In this particular image, note the waterfall. And you might not be able to see it very well, but there's a debate about whether the water that's coming out of the canister was added later through a process known as dodging and burning. But as American troops got bogged down in a pitiless war, the press turned bad for the liberators. Pictures of torture, like this one, involving a technique euphemistically called water cure, began to show up in magazines back home, not unlike Abu Ghraib. President Theodore Roosevelt assured a friend when it appeared in the American press that it was an old Filipino method of torture, adding incredulously that the Filipinos had inflicted terrible tortures on our peoples. For reporters on the scene from the New York Evening Post and the Times, it was a harrowing spectacle. And soon there would be congressional hearings on torture practices inflicted upon the liberated. With detention camps and stories of torture, eventually came massacres. And the most notorious took place on the sides of the volcano known as Budaho. In 1903, American military rulers of the Philippines got bogged down in a holy war with Muslim chiefs of Moroland. At dusk, on March 7th, 1906, an unknown, I don't know who took this photograph, photographer scrambled up the steamy slopes of an extinct volcano called Budaho. And there he found, in the middle you could see him, Captain A.M. Wetherill and his troops standing over a trench filled with hundreds of dead civilians, felled in a hail of Yankee gunfire. Tripod set, the cameraman got his shot. He then followed the retreating troops to their base. And despite efforts, and there's a whole story behind this, efforts on the part of the governor to control the media fallout of the Battle of Budaho and chase down the plates of this original photograph, a teacher smuggled, probably a missionary teacher, smuggled the plates to Japan while on furlough, and from there the images reached stateside. Journalists in Manila also had other ideas about how to report on the atrocity, and cables began to reach newsrooms within days of now President Theodore Roosevelt's public celebration of Christian heroes for honoring the flag. In a very famous speech, Roosevelt had declared that Wetherill and his troops had brought distinction to the flag. Almost immediately thereafter, the images began to appear in the press. The images and testimonies of what became called the Budaho massacre splattered across the pages of magazines and papers. To the original stench, you can almost feel it if you look at the photograph, of rotting bodies was added the odor of a cover-up. The nation called for a congressional inquiry, and aging Mark Twain wrote a bitterly sarcastic letter to President Roosevelt. In the end, he never sent it. And W.E.B. Du Bois, remember him, we're going to come back to Du Bois at the end, took one look at the Budaho photograph and wrote to the president of the Anti-Imperial League, "I want especially to have it framed," he said, "and put upon a wall of my recitation room to impress upon my students what war, and especially wars of conquest, really mean." Images like this turned the white man's burden into an emblem from all that was wrong about the white man's hubris. And this is a poem written by an African-American pastor in the wake of Kipling's poem and the War of 1898. What humanitarianism was then from the start, an open question. While Kipling played to the idea of an Anglo-American fraternal bond of shared imperial destinies, there also emerged a portrait of victimhood far away. The global public sphere then became a battlefield for competing imperial imagery, a struggle for moral superiority in the pursuit of rival civilizing missions. Now, as empires knotted people into clashing and colluding humanitarianisms, they spawned new literary figures and styles drawn from the challenge and horror of governing others. But the fin de siècle introduced one more step, to bring to the fore the entanglements of interests. In other words, as visuals and stories created encounters between strangers, there emerged not just a sense of moral commitment and an appeal to self-interest to challenge the way in which empires were pulling the world together. There would emerge by 1910 not just a moral denunciation of empire, but a questioning of whether empire was in the reader and viewer's own self-interest by learning about what empire was doing to strangers far away. To illustrate how this worked, I want to focus now on just one episode involving truth-tellers and slaves, shareholders and crusaders. and how it anticipated the way in which the media, humanitarian brokers, and authorities jostled in the public sphere for moral and material high ground. Like so many previous European conquests, this one started with high hopes and ended in scandals about latter-day conquistadors and their cruelty to natives. The mixture of opportunism and service to a higher purpose was confused by design, for they represented the mixed motives that Europeans had for contact with and integration of distant strangers. I'm going to focus on the Congo region, for the International Association of the Congo, which had been founded in 1884 by the Belgian King Leopold II, was recognized contingently by other European powers as a framework for uplifting and integrating Congolese into the powers of commercial benevolence. But rumors, particularly produced by missionaries, circulated that the police were hoarding noses because Leopold had his own force publique to enforce order in the region. The rumors began to leak out that the police, the force publique, were hoarding noses, hands, and ears in baskets to terrorize an unwilling and increasingly starved population to extract rubber. They conformed to ancient stereotypes of tropical cannibalism, black barbarism, and the tropics as a land of unfree labor waiting to be liberated. By 1896, missionaries were sending reports of an oppressive regime of thugs and extortionists, and inspectors began to note widespread depopulation. Probing journalists began to look at Leopold's account books and found huge discrepancy in his earnings and his what was called royal liberality. And reporting soon shaded into genres like fiction. And no one made this move better than the émigré Pole, Joseph Conrad, who joined the British Merchant Marine and worked his way up to captain, seafaring and riverine excursions into forbidding parts like the Congo, which gave him the stage sets for stories and novels about global encounters. Conrad made the genre his, declaring that, quote, experience is pushed a little, and only a very little, beyond the actual facts of the case, unquote. While working for a Belgian trading company, Conrad found himself captaining steamers up the Congo River, the setting and experience for his most immortal novella, The Heart of Darkness. The oeuvre appeared as a serialized, remember the press, the serialized and illustrated stories in magazines like Fortnightly Review and the Illustrated London News. And it was Blackwood's magazine that took the parts that would add up to the world's most famous tropical atrocity novel, Heart of Darkness. But behind the novel was a real story and real characters. Roger Casement, the Irish-descended British imperial diplomat, would emerge as another archetype of this global age. An agent of empire, he too would view the horrors of European colonization through new lenses, literally new lenses. The National Museum of Ireland has the camera, which I'm going to show you in just a minute, that he used on an expedition to Amazonia to look into atrocities perpetrated against native peoples of the region there in 1910, 1911. Casement, this photograph is taken, he's on his way out of the courthouse in London as he has been tried, for those of you who don't know the story, for treason as he was caught colluding with the Germans at the beginning of the Easter Uprising. But at the time, Casement teamed up with E.D. Morel, the former clerk of a Liverpool shipping company, who probed into the what was called the Congo Free State's accounts to find evidence of rampant abuse, and thereafter became a tireless publicist of the cause to strip the Belgian king of his possession. Casement and Morel argued that the Free State argued against the Free State for humanitarian and for self-interested reason, and this was the cocktail that had its effect. Casement authored a devastating report in 1904 that created a template for reporting the truth, as he called it, and we get the origins of truth commissions, behind the workings of the world economy. Casement by then was a seasoned hand, having gone to the tropics to work for the Congo Railway Company. And while there, Casement had met Joseph Conrad in 1889, 1890, we're not exactly sure of the date, but for several weeks, Casement and Conrad shared a room, enough time for Casement to rub off on the younger mariner. And you have to imagine, so Casement is a very charismatic figure for the younger Polish writer. He becomes a very influential figure in Conrad's imaginaire. And the character of Charlie Marlowe in The Heart of Darkness owes much to what Conrad saw in the profile of Casement and his growing disenchantment with Europe's colonizing mission. How much did Conrad take from the horse's mouth, whose words from The Heart of Darkness were these, quote, "The conquest of the earth, which mostly means the taking it away from those who have a different complexion or slightly flatter noses to ourselves, is not a pretty thing when you look at it too much. What redeems is the idea only, an idea at the back of it, not a sentimental pretense, but an idea and an unselfish belief in the idea, something you can set up and bow down before and offer sacrifice to." We don't know were these Casement's words or Conrad's, but we do have the transcripts from Casement's diary. Over and over, he notes the depopulation over 20 years, the emptied villages, and the trail of human remains, literally human remains, especially severed heads, baskets of them in every market square. There are photographs of them. And his outrage is fevered. At one marketplace, he saw 242 men sitting with their rubber, all guarded like convicts. To call this trade, he underlies, Casement noted furiously, is the height of lying. And Morel sees the opportunities of the 1904 report and the images that came with it. And as an activist, he saw the graphic opportunities for drumming up support for an assault on King Leopold's personal claims. Back in Britain, the protests and gatherings were not just occasions for speechifying, but for lurid lantern slideshows. Remember that I warned you we would get back to the slideshow motif of mutilation. Concerned citizens gathered in churches and chapels around the country to hear testimonies and see displays of early photographs projected onto makeshift screens. Morel's atrocity meetings soon made their way into the press. There was this photograph, probably posed to bring out the sheer pathos of the moment. I can tell you the story behind the staging of the photograph if you want, to bring out the pathos of the moment that illustrated Morel's own narrative of Leopold's violations of human dignity. It features one of the characters in Morel's tale of woe, Sala from the town of Walla, seated in front of what remained of his 5-year-old daughter, a hand and a foot. Morel alleged that the rest of her was eaten, along with the mother, at a feast held by the king's soldiers. This would have been one of the lantern slides used to shock his audiences. What ensued was an escalating war of images and words and publicity assault that had the pro-Leopold side reeling. And now they put up their fight as well, with a team of publicists and photographers to produce counter-narratives of their own. The war of images is an old one. The German and American press also piled on with their own sensational accounts. The Congo affair was one of the great causes célèbres in an era of heightened publicity about wrongdoings in distant parts, facilitated by the sudden expansion of a global press. It also reflected the rising power of civic organizations mobilized to defend the rights of others. Now, I said that what's important are the ways in which the images get embedded in stories. That's what gives them meaning and significance. I'm going to start accelerating this a little bit. And just to say that from the experience in the Congo, Casement will then go to the Amazon and get pulled into a similar inquiry, this one, though, differing only to the extent that it was not a campaign waged against a rival European empire, but in the atrocities that he explored in the Putumayo region, he focused on the doings of an English company, the Peruvian Amazon company that was extracting rubber from the Amazon region. And arguing that the company had violated the law, anti-slavery laws, and as in the case of Leopold's Congo, monopolizing markets, and this is why the emphasis on trade and importance of free trade, and denying the rights of English consumers to have access to cheaper products because prices were being manipulated by this cabal of executives in London. So he leads a report, yields another shocking set of inquiries with images and texts, an expose of flogging, torture, and rape, a seam of sexualized violence, and there's a kind of current of Casement's own tropes about debased masculinity, and the role that race plays is very important because the henchmen on the ground are half-breed ruffians. And so, in a sense, what Casement is trying to do is to go out to defend the pure Aborigine people against local Creoles as the abusers. In February 1911, he wrote the Foreign Office to explain that he was full up with the horrors at times, and it is only the thought of those poor, hunted, gentle beings up there in the forests that keeps me going. So what conjoins the abused Indians extracting rubber to London, ostensibly, and the interests of English subjects and consumers was this company. And it led to a set of inquiries in the House of Commons and an effort in March of 1914 to apply the Slave Trade Acts and violations of other restrictions against coerced labor. And in fact, the case got an airing that summer of 1914. July 9th, there was a reading before the House. It then got buried by events in the Balkans. And within weeks, Britain had declared war. The Putumayo immediately were forgotten. And of course, Casement was on his own voyage to work for the cause of Irish independence. Who was the real barbarian? Casement asked. The company might cease to exist, that is the Peruvian Amazon company, but rubber and exploitation of Indians would go on. Arana, who had been the owner of the chief executive of the company, Casement noted bitterly at the end of the saga, can return to his vomit. So long as global integration was left to the devices of a clique of London financiers and unscrupulous hucksters in the peripheries, it would only bring misery to the natives of the world and deny Englishmen the rightful share of the expanding global pie. This is where the moral and the self-interested threads get tied together. Casement would be knighted. He became Sir Roger, which was what was all the more shocking about the treason in 1916. To acknowledge that out there in the tropics, evil people were doing evil things to innocent people. The flip side was the presumption that natives could only be saved by the enforcement of British laws on a British public company made accountable by a mobilized British public opinion. As with the Congo movement, and here are the limits of humanitarianism, with the Congo movement, there was an underlying view that the free trade from Europe, no monopolies, no skullduggery, would be the condition to make free labor in the periphery flourish. There may be no going back to some pristine Edenic age of innocence living in some state of nature. The market, Casement acknowledged, was here to stay. But at least the defenders of the natives could promote a gentler humanity, as he put it, by exposing the nefarious collusions of Europeans and their local allies. Okay, I'm going to skip a whole section here, which is about China and the Ottomans. And the important point here is the way in which photographs of the Boxer rebellions and atrocities committed against Armenians get entangled into this knot of inter-imperial rivalries, and how that ratchets up and mobilizes even more photographers to catalog what's going on out in the peripheries. Let me wind it down then. Stories, images, chronicles of what was going on in the world circulated through the high-end and low-end press alike to form impressions of a world that was both far away yet interconnected. Humanity may now seem like a blur, even more so in our digital age. But there was a time that the agents involved in representing the lot of others tried to turn their audiences and readers from bystanders into witnesses themselves, attaching them with mixtures of empathy and self-interest to the fate of strangers. This sense of global connection and interdependence, I promised you Du Bois, of encounters and cruelties, was in the air when a 32-year-old African-American writer, W.E.B. Du Bois, sat down to compose his own worldview. And while attending the first Pan-African Conference in London, organized by Caribbean leaders in the summer of 1900, just as the news of the horrors in the Congo were starting to circulate, he tried his hand at a public letter in his Address to the Nations of the World. He had also organized, as we're saying, for this occasion, a 500 photograph exhibition. This is a set of some of the images for the Paris World Exhibition that year, teaming up with the African-American photographer Daniel Murray to convey the progress of Negroes in America, what was then called the American Negro Exhibition. So while he's trying to convey the ways in which African Americans were now part of the civilized world, this genre of the open letter was itself not new. 2 years earlier, in 1898, Émile Zola had issued his stinging rebuke of the French military and its hypocrisy and bigotry in J'accuse. Still unknown to the world, though, W.E.B. Du Bois followed suit with an epistle to the great power rulers. And the letter was part of the closing statement of the London conference while these photographs were being exhibited in Paris, and unveiled some immortalized worlds that have ever since been a refrain about the condition of the excluded other. And they are worth recalling. You can read this as I finish. The idea of the 20th century having a core problem, as he would later say in a few years, and that the core problem was a racial dividing line, has become an American mantra. What I want to suggest is that we also can think of it as a global tract. But Du Bois had not intended to frame the problem of the color line as a peculiarly American one. What was unique to America was only that it had internalized rather than externalized the line. Beyond America, his Minority Report became a plea on behalf of what he called the other half of the world. London and the experience of exhibiting those photographs of African Americans in Paris had fired him up. And when he returned to Atlanta with the color line in his head, he sat down to compose his 1903 classic, The Souls of Black Folk. I have to confess, this was not a book I'd even heard of growing up in Toronto, and it was part of the encounter of moving to the United States. I don't know whether people read it at all now, but you might want to take a dip into it. Du Bois was not a tragedian like Casement. He was committed to the progressive idea that humans could understand each other, at least for the moment. Though there were moments in which this faith got tested, nor was Du Bois like the romantic Prokudin-Gorsky, cataloging scattered strangers in service to a moral economy ruled by a pious emperor. The other to Du Bois was the excluded, exploited, the oppressed. The other could also be the stranger at home. Key to his global thinking for Du Bois was going beyond the witness of others' pains and predicament. The key was giving voice to the other. How to get majorities, or those with power and privilege, to understand what life was like on the other side. Photographs were clearly important for him, so was the written word. And rising to the challenge starts for him by seeing that the other is not just an inverted reflection of civilization, not just a primitive version of our advanced selves. Du Bois underscored that as the world grew integrated, it was the fate of the other to live within the image and story produced by the civilizer. The Boxer Rebellion, this is why it's too bad I chopped that part out of it, because he's reading the news of what's happening in China as he's writing The Souls of Black Forest, shocked at what's going on. The Boxer Rebellion for Du Bois, and he would argue, that was a signature moment, for there was no escape from the assembly by European weapons, European capital, and European theory. The world's non-whites were caught between the impossible options of assimilation or separation. The other was therefore forced to carry a specific load, starting with the fact that being a problem was a problem. How does it feel to be a problem? Du Bois asked. I seldom answer the word, he explained. And in an effort to find a voice, to convey what it was like to be seen to be someone else's burden, to be governed and civilized, required starting with the strangeness itself. Being a problem is a strange experience, he confessed. Every breath condemned the stranger to feel his or her strangeness. And what followed was one of the most piercing insights into what it was like to develop an integrated consciousness in a divided world. If global integration expanded the radius of encounters with strangers, it also created the means to have these encounters without having to leave home. Strangers were no longer imaginary fixtures of abstract philosophical or economic ideas. That's my quick shorthand response to the 18th century historians among you. It's coming, I can tell. Reportage made them part of a story of global integration. The effect was to create a sense of amalgamation of the world into one unit, indivisible as well as visible, more connected to the stories of expanding civilizations. And by 1900, some brokers had pushed the understanding of what was going on around the world a step further. The divides between civilized and savage were not just incidental to the ways in which missionaries, cables, cameras, and railways connected the world up. These hierarchies were the result of the ways in which the world was being carved into haves and have-nots. This is what made the fates of the other so disturbing to the moral principles of 19th century liberalism. The images of cruelty and stories of brutality in distant parts were not just accidents, the unfortunate collateral damage of globalization. Casement, Du Bois, Morel, and others insisted that rubber, sugar, or cotton had become everyday staples thanks to a system that separated the civilized from the savage, because it relied on cheap land and forced labor of others to enrich the civilized. Their eyewitnessing disturbed the moral principles of liberalism, not just because the content of cruelty upset the happy story of expanding freedom, though it did do that. More importantly, reporting from the other side of the veil showed how the beneficiaries had an interest in the fate of the other, whether out of Christian bond with another of God's creatures, a curiosity to know about our origins as natural man, or because enslavement or bonded labor was lucre to monopoly capitalists. The stranger was not, therefore, a spectacle piece. When Du Bois appealed to the great powers, he commingled their sense of humanity and their self-interest. If you can see it in the text, if the world of culture could bend itself towards giving Negroes and other dark men a chance at education and self-development, this would have the beneficial effect upon the world and hasten progress. While imperial writers like Kipling appealed to paternalistic benevolence, Du Bois had something else in mind, keeping black man exploited, ravaged, and degraded was an affront to justice, freedom, and general enlightened self-interest. Everyone he noted, depended on a generous recognition of the righteousness of our cause. This is Aleppo, back to Aleppo. Last September, those of us living in the United States witnessed images such as this in circulation while then candidate Trump was dismissing any American interest in Syria. Leave it to Assad and to the Russians. One only has to see how the switch gets flicked to see how he could go from complete disinterest to throwing 59 Tomahawk missiles at an airbase in Syria to get a sense of just how fickle the ties to strangers could be. But whether out of patrician beliefs, religious obligation, or a commonwealth of strangers bound by the strands of mutual interest, the end of the 19th century produced basic elements of global thinking of which humanitarianism was a part. And in this sense, we can remind when we look at an image like this, the contingency of these images. Why Susan Sontag's concern about the pendulum between empathy and apathy and the ambiguities of global thinking haunt us still. Thank you very much.